Wow, nice spectacles.
Hi, this is Bret Primack. I want to welcome you to a very special Google Hangout, a memorial to our friend, a remarkable creator, Bob Belden, a man who has 22 CDs released under his own name. He produced hundreds of other CDs and 500 catalog titles, but that's just a small part of who Bob Belden was. And we're going to talk about Bob today with some friends and collaborators. First of all, I want to introduce Tim Hagans. Tim's a trumpeter. Tim, when did you first meet Bob?
Well, you know, it's a funny and a rather long story, but I first played with Bob before I met him, subbing one night at the Village Vanguard, and he played a wild tenor solo on Interloper, the first tune of the night, and I didn't really catch his name, but all I saw, I was in the trumpet section, so I saw him backlit this amazing character with really long hair playing these wild eighth notes, and so I remembered him from that evening, and I didn't really realize it was the same guy who called me about 2 years later in 1989, I believe, perhaps late 1988. And we talked for about 2 hours about Miles and Coltrane and my history and his history, our mutual friends. And he invited me to a rehearsal at Don Sickler's in January of 1989. And that's when I first met him. And then when I saw him, I said, oh, this is the cat that played that incredible solo at the Vanguard. So that's how we met. And that was the first rehearsal for the Treasure Island Band.
Okay, cool. And next we go to a baritone saxophonist and the winner of the Best Eyeglass Frames in New York City, Gary Smulyan. Gary,
Hey, Brett.
tell us how you met Bob.
I met Bob in 1979 when can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I met Bob in 1979 when he replaced Joe Lovano on Woody Herman's Young Thundering Herd. He came out of North Texas State, and he joined the band. And like Tim said, he played. I mean, he was wild even back then in 1979. He was very heavily influenced by Wayne Shorter, who was his hero on the tenor, and so between he and Frank Tiberi, who also played tenor and was heavily into Coltrane, it was like between Bob and Frank, it was the history of post-bop modern jazz tenor saxophone playing in that section. Bob really came in pretty fully developed as a musician. He wrote an arrangement on Countdown, which was orchestrated for the saxophone section, and it was really clear from the beginning that Bob was slated for great things in his life. He was incredibly dedicated and intelligent and organized and hyper-focused, and his playing reflected all of that.
Absolutely, as did his composing, arranging, and producing. And Tim and Gary and I, of course, know Bob through the music, but we've got another special guest today, Richard O'Neill. First of all, Dick, for those of us who don't know you, just a word of introduction about what you do.
Sure. Well, actually, I met Bob because of my work for the Secretary of Defense. That may seem odd for a jazz musician, but I run a forum for the Secretary for the last 20 years called the Highlands Forum. And we were looking for some people to help us think about imagination, creativity, and innovation. And so part of that discussion meant we were looking at people who are doing brain research, we were looking at people who are artists, and it just seemed like a natural to bring somebody in from the creative world of jazz. And I had never met Bob, but I had heard the Black Dahlia before since I was a big fan of the Elroy book, and I'd looked for everything Black Dahlia I could find online. And I ran across his great work, Black Dahlia, and I just cold called him one day and asked him if he would be interested in meeting me in New York for lunch, and we did. And he was fascinating. I think he's one of the most interesting people I've ever known, and to have him be interested in issues of national security would, I think, be putting it mildly. He probably emailed me twice a day, every day, for the better part of a few years with issues of things going on in Peru and Venezuela and what's going on in the Ukraine, and he'd send me book ideas, things he'd read. Just a really interesting man. So when it came time to put together something for another piece of work I was doing, that for the Alliance for Peace Building, the opposite of the Secretary of Defense's work, he was very interested in going to Iran. He just thought it would be a great way to get track 2 diplomacy started, and asked if we could help him do that. And that's what we did the last year or so, was to try to work to put that together, and he was able to get to Iran.
So he actually asked to go.
Yeah.
Wow,
yeah, it was really Bob's
amazing.
idea. We were just, it was all his idea. We were just the facilitators. I'll be glad to share with you a story about it too. After he came back, he was supposed to speak here in town at the U.S. Institute for Peace and the Alliance for Peace Building's annual conference in Washington. He made it here on May the 14th to be able to speak to hundreds of people about his work in Iran. And just before he went on stage, he sent me an email note, and I wasn't able to be there. I was in Spain at the time, and he sent me a very long note, which I'm looking at on the other screen right now, about his ideas for what he thought he could do for peace-building initiatives around the world. Now that he'd realized all that he could do in Iran, he wanted to try something amazing, which included Pakistan, India, China, all variety of other places. He was really committed to this.
Dick, how is it that a jazz musician, certainly Bob was more than just a musician, does something that seemingly the United States government can't even do on their own?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think sometimes because it is the government, it's hard to do things, and you get a private individual who has no stake in governmental policies or anything, but represents himself and his ideas and his values. He actually can do something else, and he's not threatening in any way. He's not something that people would be wary of. In fact, they welcome him. And jazz speaks to people all over the world, as music does generally. Jazz does very specifically, and Bob created something that hadn't been done in 40 years or more, being able to be asked to go to Iran and to participate with Iranian musicians. So I give him a lot of credit for doing some things that nobody else was even thinking about doing, and with any luck, it'll start something new.
And Dick, from your people, what was the reaction in Iran to Bob and his music?
Well, I did get to see the videos of the crowd reaction, then some of the videos of his interaction with kids and other musicians around the country. But it was very positive everywhere I went, and little kids, would be going off on a school trip and they'd see him and he'd wave to them and they'd say, "We love you." They knew he was American, or at least spoke English. And the reaction was just extraordinarily positive. The reaction to his music was extraordinary, and standing ovations in the venues. He was so stoked when he came back. Like I said, he wrote me this very long email about all the possible combinations of countries where we had really troubled relations, where he thought we could do something with music.
Well, back in the 50s and the 60s, jazz musicians toured for the State Department. Dizzy Gillespie did an infamous tour in 1962. Benny Goodman played in Moscow to try to melt some of the ice in the Cold War. Realistically, Dick, do you think more of these things can happen now in today's world?
I think they have to happen, actually, because so many of the frameworks that we have for better relations with not just Iran, but a number of countries, are stalled. And I think, like you see with Pope Francis, for example, becoming more and more involved with other world leaders to try to find ways to move things forward, I think music is going to do the same thing, and it has to. Culture is a way of combining these things to make relations maybe more positive. So hopefully somebody will pick up the banner from Bob, what he started, and will find a way to do it, either in his memory or just doing it going forward in their own way.
Great. We'll come back to Dick in a moment here, but we've been joined by David Chesky, the pianist, composer, and artistic force between Chesky Records. David, how are you?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Can you talk about how you first encountered Bob Belden?
I don't know. I don't know. I just know him for so long. I just have no idea how we met.
Okay. Good answer. Let me turn it around here. Bob Belden has a recording coming out on your label very soon. This is maybe his last project coming out here. Can you tell us something about it and your collaboration with him on the project?
I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Here we go. Bob and I were hanging out one day, and we were just talking about ideas because he's into binaural sound as we are. And we were thinking, and I would sit there and explain how we do things with this dummy head, head transfer function works, and he's always sending me his mixes. He's trying to do surround and all that. So I said, let's do a surround project. You can hear me still?
Yep.
Okay. I said, let's do a surround project because I want to place people around this microphone head and let's do something. And he said, okay. And he went back and thought a few days, 3 days. He says, I want to recreate in a silent way, but we'll call it in an ambient way, and we'll put people around the microphone. So this is a binaural 360-degree record, so it's in surround. And, you know, he picked the players, and we just booked the date, and we did it.
And when is that coming out, David?
It comes out in the fall, pretty soon, in September.
Now, Bob's produced albums for a number of people. Gary, let's talk about your incredible project with Bob, the String Project. He produced that and he wrote the arrangements. Could you give us a picture of what it's like to collaborate with Bob, pre-production, writing the charts and so forth, and also Bob in the studio?
Well, the thing that was really so great about Bob is that you know, we'd known each other for so long and worked together, and so he kind of knew my sound and he knew how to just frame the way I played perfectly. So I came up with the tunes, and I gave him complete carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. There was I was not involved in any of the writing. I said, you know, you're so on it and just really takes care of business in such a beautiful way that he just knew exactly what to do perfectly without any input from me at all, except for the tunes and the kind of the changes that I wanted to improvise on. And the thing about that record, which was interesting, was that record was really largely successful because of Bob. That was the first recording that Crisscross made that was multi-track. Up to that point, they had recorded just live the 2-track. And so there was a problem with the board. And we only had 6 hours to record it anyway, and under the best of circumstances, because that's how much time that Crisscross gave to record. So we had 6 hours to do a record, and we lost 2 of them due to technical issues with the board. So we actually had 4 hours to do that record with no rehearsal, and so every take on that record is only 1 take, and we didn't do any listen backs. We just kind of just played and recorded, and that's what we got. And Bob was so incredible in the studio. He was so organized and so together, and I mean, he really rallied the troops, and that was really part of Bob's genius too. Was just in terms of how he would just handle the, you know, being in front of other musicians and just make sure that things were happening in a timely way.
Absolutely. One of Bob's most celebrated project is his Black Dahlia recording. Before I talked to Tim about that, Dick, you expressed an interest in the subject, the story of Black Dahlia. When you first heard that music, do you think it reflected the story itself?
I do. You know, you have to know about the Black Dahlia. First of all, Bob was influenced by a couple of things. He was influenced by the story, the Elroy story, which was the same thing that got my attention. He was also influenced by something else, which I've had a sort of an obsession with over the last 40 years, is Roman Polanski's Chinatown and the Jerry Goldsmith score. It just absolutely was amazing to me, the solo trumpet. And Bob told me in our first meeting that was a big influence on his thinking when he put that together. So in thinking about the story of the Dahlia and thinking about how Bob made this leap at a very, very low period in his life, in fact, he equated his period of the late 90s when he was really having some health issues, you know, thinking about mortality. It really helped him to think about the Dahlia a lot more in terms of the story. So for me, the Black Dahlia, the whole recording is just spectacular. And when I heard Tim and Bob playing it at Manhattan School of Music, it was really an overwhelming experience, I think. There have been other attempts at the Black Dahlia since then. There was certainly the Brian De Palma movie, which wasn't very good. The score of Mark Isham, you know, is a pretty good score, but it also borrows from Bob and it borrows from Jerry Goldsmith. So I think Bob's an original, you know, with a little bit of influence from Jerry Goldsmith. But that story and that score that he wrote are so intertwined and so perfectly compelling mood is just really dark and pervasive. So I'm still stuck with it. I listen to it all the time, and I tell friends about it all the time.
Absolutely. Now, Tim, you were part of the recording. Bob wrote the charts. He conducted. He produced it. A lot of players in the studio there. What do you remember about the project?
Well, I'd like to say a few things just to reinforce what Dick said, that Bob really looked at the Black Dahlia as a metaphor for what perhaps all of us go through at many times in our lives being artists. This was about a woman who came from a small suburb of Boston, Medford, I believe, went to Hollywood to try to make it big in the movies. And you know, I grew up in Ohio, and as soon as I saw West Side Story as a kid and people dancing in the streets and that great music, I thought, well, that's where I have to live, because that's where probably the most incredible artistic things happen. And you know, you come to New York, and I meet all these people that have that same draw and ambition. And a lot of people go through very hard times. Bob certainly did. We've all experienced these times. And some people, of course, they haven't met the violent end that Elizabeth Short met, but people go through some pretty terrible things, and a lot of people end up leaving. And so it was a big metaphor, especially in that period that Dick alluded to, where Bob was having health problems. And I always thought the music was a soundtrack looking for a movie. And I know Bob was in contact, perhaps, with some of Brian De Palma's people, and Blue Note was trying to make contact that this music could be part of the score. And I think, you know, perhaps a project down the line is to take that soundtrack that's already written and make some kind of film to it. It would be incredible. But we did it at Sony Studios, which is no longer there, on 54th Street, I believe. And I walked in, I had no idea what to expect. There were no rehearsals. It was a huge orchestra, many people I knew, many people I did not. It was just a huge ensemble. And I sat in the trumpet section with Lou Soloff and Alan Rubin, Tony Cadillac, and I just thought that I was playing section parts, and Bob motions for me to come in front of the orchestra, and we started off with Genesis. And immediately I heard where the influence came from, Chinatown, and also another Elroy book, James Elroy book, L.A. Confidential, that was made into a movie, and Malcolm McNabb played incredible trumpet throughout that film, as did Ewan Racy in Chinatown, the trumpet solo. So all of a sudden I was put into that situation, and I thought, Bob, why didn't you give me this music in advance so I could look at it? Because I was basically sight reading. But that was Bob's way of doing things. He liked the surprise element. He reminds me a lot of John Cassavetes and the way John Cassavetes made films, where many times the actors didn't know if they were being filmed or not, or if the scene had started or stopped. And John was telling them things in their ears that they had to like edit out later. Bob did the same thing. He came over to me one time in the studio, and for once I wasn't playing a bunch of wild eighth notes on the recording. I thought I'd start off a little easy on some kind of electronic groove and build into something. And he just comes over and he moves my headphone a little bit and he says, play only eighth notes. And he put the headphones back in the middle of me playing, you know. So it was always that kind of vibe and the things that Bob did. And that's, of course, as Cassavetes put so much human emotion and the human nature and the element of being in the moment into Bob's music. It was incredible. But those 2 days that we recorded Black Dahlia were very moving for everybody, because you could feel the whole orchestra after an hour or so began to feel what project this was as it was being made, not during rehearsals and then coming in and playing it. It was like we all kind of just started looking at each other thinking, this is incredible. And of course Bob is standing there conducting in a very colorful shirt with this grin on his face, like, you know, just trust me, everything will be cool. You know?
Well, it certainly was cool. There's a YouTube video of the session, the Genesis session that Tim talks about. Another element throughout Bob's remarkable life is his love of Miles Davis and his Miles Davis reissues and redoing, recasting Miles, Miles in India, Espanol Miles, or I forget the name of the Spanish recording. David, you worked on a number of projects. What do you think it was about Miles that really captured Bob?
You know, I can't tell you, but I can tell you this, that maybe it was the combination of Gil and Miles that captured Bob, because, you know, when I listen to his records, especially the one you just talked about, Black Dahlia, that it's very sophisticated, and I think the combination of Miles and Gil and this reflection of Bob's writing, you know, it inspired him because it's very cerebral, it's very sophisticated. Bob was a guy with a great wit and great intelligence, and these type of things interest him. I don't think, you know, you'd see Bob, you know, trying to do very commercial, you know, funky kind of hit stuff or something. It just wasn't his thing, and especially the things. My favorite thing of Bob.
Oh, we lost Mr. Chesky there. Tim Hagans, why don't you jump in here?
Well, I was going to again reinforce what David said about Miles and Gil, and you know, when I think of Sketches of Spain and Porgy and Bess, the other you know, Quiet Nights, the collaborations between those two, I think of them, even though I'm a trumpet player, just as much as Gil Evans recordings as I do with their Miles recordings, and I think Bob was like the perfect combination of both of those personas. And in his projects, he wanted not only to be a saxophone player, but to have, like, and I mean this in a positive way, total control over everything artistic that happened. And he wasn't a control freak in the way that he was kind of in your face. He was very gentle about this, and everybody trusted him so much that it was very easy for him to dictate pretty much everything, because it was always the perfect solution. But, you know, we did 2 records together for Blue Note, having to do with drum and bass, Animation, Imagination, and then a live record, Reanimation. And on the first one, the studio recording, it came out under my name, but I actually felt it was really Bob's record in many ways, and the second one that we did, the live record, Reanimation, came out under both of our names, so, but I felt like, you know, Bob had created this incredible soundscape picture that we were going to do over an hour's worth of music, and I was just lucky enough to be the main soloist on this recording, even though it was my record. And so when I listen to those 2 records, I think of them really as Bob Belden recordings, and I was just incredibly lucky to be the soloist on them. And I think that goes back to what David was saying about you know, Miles and Gil influencing Bob.
Can I interject?
Yeah.
You know, it's funny you mention that, because in my iPhone, those are the records I carry around. I really think that art has to reflect time and culture. And I think most of jazz is repetitive, and even, you know, I was talking to Bob about this, even when I'm trying to do my little band, stretching the harmonic language. I think what Bob did with the animation projects is even better, because he is getting away from the whole concept of using harmonic language. He's doing things with sounds. So I think most people can't even get into that record because it's so far ahead of the comprehension of people. I think the concept of using sound to play on rather than notes and all that, it's much hipper, and it's so fresh, and it so reflects contemporary urban society, and it's a great thing. I mean, those are my actual favorite records with Tim and Bob, animation.
Yes, definitely.
Oh,
now,
cool.
Let's go way back. Gary, the Woody Herman Band. Set the stage for me. You're with Woody Herman. This new tenor player comes in. First of all, many people in our audience don't know anything about big bands. It's from a different era. Those of us on the other side of 50, perhaps, we remember those days. Seth, give us a picture of what it was like to be in the Woody Herman Band, being on the road with Bob Belden.
Okay. Okay, well, this was at a period where, in the late 70s, where there were still a lot of big bands on the road. Maynard Ferguson's band, Buddy Rich, Dan Kenton. These bands were all touring 50 weeks a year, and a lot of the colleges were, like North Texas State and University of Miami and other schools that had good big band and jazz programs at that time, were feeder schools into these bands. So a lot of young musicians came out of these universities, and so, like I said, Bob came in and actually he fit right in, because the bar was set pretty high with Lovano leaving, so Woody kind of had that sound in his head, and so Bob came in playing really radically different than Joe, coming really seriously, deeply, heavily influenced by Wayne, and which was a really different just sound concept-wise in terms of how that impacted in the section. So, when you joined the band, there was no audition. You would just play, and you had to jump in, and there was no sense that that you were in or you weren't, because Woody was not. You didn't get a lot of feedback that way. He would just kind of you'd be there, and if he didn't like you, you were just gone, and there was no explanation of why. So nobody ever really. It was always kind of pins and needles the first couple of weeks or the first couple of months, because you could be gone at any time. But like I said, Bob's playing was so heavily developed, and he was such a strong personality on the tenor that, and so radically different than everybody else in the section, that he brought something really refreshing to the sound of the band and to the sound of the saxophone section, which was really great. He was also at that time supreme practical joker. Like, I was also into reading thrillers, Frederick Forsyth and Robert Ludlum, and mystery novels, and Bob got a huge kick out of ripping the last 5 pages out of these books, and just sitting in the back of the bus in his seat and watching a reaction as you would get to the end of the book, and all of a sudden the last 5 pages would be gone. So he got a big kick out of that. So it was just, I think that was a part of his formative experience, just developing his mission. Like a lot of us, we were in our early 20s, just starting out. And I think that experience just laid the groundwork for everything else that would come for Bob, as it did for a lot of other people.
Let's talk a little bit about Bob Belden, the person. David Chesky, you've spent time with Bob, you've hung with Bob, you told me you guys walked a lot on the streets of New York. What happened when you walked along with Bob? What did you talk about?
Everything. Music, philosophy, life. He's a very smart, intelligent, witty guy. I liked his jokes. He was clever. He was super fast and sharp. So I just, it was fun. I mean, most of the time we would probably meet up accidentally at Fairways or one of those places on the Upper West Side and just go walking for an hour.
Tim, what was it like hanging with Bob at his apartment?
Well, the first apartment that he had when I knew him was 151 West 87th Street, and it was a one-room studio. You could see the kitchen from the other side of the room. It was basically a big room with the other facilities available. And I remember when I first went there in '89, he had a black leather couch that faced his workspace. This is long before he got a computer, but his workspace, and he had a bed, a loft bed above the workspace, and his back was to the window facing West 87. And when I first went there, you could actually sit on the leather couch, and he had bookshelves with. At that point, I think he had collected every Blue Note LP. He had them in order, and the serial numbers memorized. And there were books. This is just the beginning of the CD revolution. So there were lots of CDs. There was manuscript paper everywhere. After the first year that I would hang out with him, there was one spot left on the black leather couch, And after another year, there was absolutely no place to sit except for the steps up to the loft bed, which was basically sitting right next to Bob at his desk. And then after another year, all of those steps were filled with CDs. So, and I wondered how he got up to the loft bed, But it was that kind of a classic artist place where you walked in, and I immediately felt at home. And he immediately started talking about something, and I would just hang out there for hours. He would talk to people on the phone, on the speakerphone. This is another one of his practical jokes. He loved to talk to people on the speakerphone when I was sitting there. And then after about a half hour after they've revealed their innermost secrets and emotions and paranoias and everything, he says, "Oh, by the way, Hagans is sitting here. Say hello." You know. So that was the hang, and then he moved across the hall to a duplex, and it was the same kind of hang. After a year or so, you couldn't sit down anywhere, and then his final place on West 76 was the same way, that black couch. The first year you could sit down, and then, you know, so I was always prepared to stand for a couple of hours when I was visiting Bob, and it was, you know, we talked about everything, like David said. He always had CNN or MSNBC on, even Fox News, I think, just to check out all the different views on the same subject of what was happening that day. He was commenting on that. He was multitasking. You know, another interesting thing is he really didn't get a computer until he was probably the last person in the world to get a computer. And I asked him why one time, and he said, "Well, as soon as I get a computer, that's going to become my full-time job. I'm going to learn everything about this technology and how to use it to do what I am visualizing." And so he held off because he was involved in, you know, producing a lot of records and writing a lot of music. And then when he got a computer, it was see you later. He had 3 monitors. He had every kind of program, modules. I mean, he was full into it. And but he was a very smart person, and he knew that if he once he took the plunge, that was going to change his life forever. You know?
Absolutely.
Wow. I could go on and on about Bob forever. So
Can I ask him a question?
Gary, go.
Tim.
Yes.
So he had 3 apartments in New York, right?
Right, 3 that I know of, but I think he lived, you know, before I met him, he had some other places.
So did he have all new stuff at every apartment when it was filled to the brim, or did he bring everything with him? And like, that's a lot of records and books and stuff.
I know.
Around.
Well, you know, this is, and I do know he had a storage place as well, you know, on the Upper West Side. So you know, it was interesting. You know, it was a very. I have some pictures, and actually Tom Everett, who worked at Blue Note Records for many years, lived right across the street from Bob on West 87th, and posted on Facebook a few weeks ago some great pictures of that apartment.
Oh,
and,
man!
You know, you can go to Tom Everett. It looks like Everett, Tom Everett, to his Facebook page and look at those pictures, and you see what I'm talking about.
Because I remember when I left Woody's band in 1980 and moved back to New York and went to visit him at his house. His place then was packed to the brim with, I mean, just floor to the ceiling was just, I mean, amazing amount of stuff, records and, like you said, books, and nowhere to walk.
Well, you know, he told me a story about, and maybe you guys remember the brothers in Harlem, the Hoarders, that they were famous in the 20s and 30s. I forget their last name, but he's the one that first told me about these guys, and they both were found deceased in the apartment because something had fallen down on them. They had just incredible, but they're the famous Hoarders. And Bob into many things. I mean, he talked about them all the time as he did the Black Dahlia. You know,
that was his next record, the Hoarders.
Right.
Gary, Bob Belden, a friend. You guys were pretty close over a number of decades. What do you remember about Bob as a friend?
Bob was his generosity, his willingness, his openness to. I mean, we had a lot of different ideas, musical ideas through the years, and he was open to any and all of them. In fact, up until the very end, I think David was involved in this peripherally, at least when he never really got off the ground. I have a friend who owns a set of Puccini gongs that were built by Puccini for Turandot, and we were talking about doing a project, recording. Bob was going to compose or adapt some Puccini arias for saxophone for Lovano and I think Ralph Lalama and a bunch of saxophones and gongs, and the talk was, you know, to record that. I mean, he was. His open spirit, his intelligence, he was incredibly quick-witted, incredibly well-read. There was just nothing that he wouldn't do for anybody. He was just that kind of a person.
Absolutely. And another thing about Bob is that he had a lot of adversity in his life. He had some health issues. He had some problems in the business, but he went straight ahead. Dick O'Neill, from your perspective, are you inspired by an individual like Bob Belden who overcomes so much and yet creates so much incredible beauty?
Yeah, you know, Bob meant a lot to me. I don't have the great pleasure of having known him for decades like Gary or Tim, but I would say having known him for 5 years and sort of a really intense last 5 years, mostly email exchanges, a few visits, and then a few meetings together. Bob was just a wonderful guy who, you know, gave me great hope. I have this sort of bipolar world I live in where I work on security or defense issues on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm working as a board member for the Alliance for Peace Building, trying to find ways to bring, you know, more peaceful conditions, stable conditions around the world. And Bob was very, very deep into both, and he thought that both of those worlds were not inconsistent with each other, and he would always send me notes. He'd send me books to read. He'd send me, you know, just ideas that he had for making the world better. He felt he was at a place in his life where he had to do something to make his life, you know, really mean something even more. And so he was attracted, I think, to both of those aspects, the polar opposites of my world, and as a result, he was just, he was constantly pouring out, you know, from himself and from ideas. And I think Tim was talking about before, he'd always have MSNBC on or Fox or, you know, some input for ideas. When he was doing one of his recent recordings, I guess, he brought the musicians in to the studio, and he was talking about how New York had changed since 9/11, and he wanted to talk about how that feeling of fear had gripped the city for a decade. And in order to really get everybody into the feeling of it, he had a number of the musicians read several books that he recommended before the session. And one of them was a friend of ours, the Pulitzer Prize winner Larry Wright, who wrote the book The Looming Tower, The Road to Al-Qaeda. And it really described what happened that day in New York, what happened prior to that, but also what happened since. And Bob wanted everybody to intellectualize and also feel that sense of fear that we'd sort of become gripped by over the decade, and then have that play out through the music. So I always thought that was an amazingly creative way of getting a process going to get people to tap into their own creativity, their own feelings, and that to me was Bob. He was just a wonderful collaborator, a wonderful guy to spur your thinking, and a passionate person. I'd say that's a great word. Somebody said generous. I'd say generous is absolutely right, and passionate as well.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, you have something about Bob's generosity?
Well, you know, Gary reminded me of a story or a tradition that Bob had, and of course what Dick just said, it's a passion and generosity for so many things. But even on a personal level, the way that Bob kind of took care of people that he was concerned about, and anybody that was in his rather large realm he was concerned about. When I first met him, and we started playing in the late 80s and early 90s, I had 3 small daughters, and he became Uncle Bob to all 3 of them. And still, they talk about, you know, they were very sad when he passed. And but he used to send me, when they were really small, every week I would get an envelope in the mail of coupons from grocery stores for baby food, for you know, diapers, for like anything you would need for small children. You know, every week these coupons came, and you know, he had gotten the newspaper, he'd clip them out, he'd put them in an envelope and sent them to me. There were probably 30 or 40 coupons for cereal, for everything, you know. And I used them because, you know, the coupons for stuff that I was buying on a weekly basis. And then, you know, at one point, you know, my girls were like 6, 8, and 10, and the coupons are still coming for diapers and everything. So I reminded them, you know, that they, you know, and so then the coupons came for, like, from Toys R Us for Barbie dolls and things that you know, coupons to Sesame Place or something, you know. I mean, he was just thinking about me as not only as a musician, but as a father and taking care of my girls, and it was a way, just, you know, I mean, he took his time to do that every week for years, you know, and there were many things like that he did for me, and also talking about you know, Bob giving books and recommended reading to get in the mood. Again, at Cassavetes, like concept. When we did the Black Dahlia, he gave me 2 books. One, of course, was James Ellroy's book, The Black Dahlia, which is part of his Los Angeles quartet of books, including L.A. Confidential. And he also gave me a book called Severed, which was kind of just a nonfiction book about the murder of Elizabeth Short. And he wanted me to really read these books, and we talked a lot about them, so I understood and I could see the metaphor that he was creating. So he worked in very effective and unusual ways.
David Chesky, Bob Belden wasn't the kind of guy who blew his own horn. He never even had his own website. And also, Bob had so many different facets, he really couldn't be characterized. You are also somebody kind of in that category as well. How did Bob navigate the music business?
Well, that's, you know, something, it's unfortunate that the best of our generation kind of gets swept aside. A guy with his talent should have gone a lot farther and been a lot more appreciated, but, you know, there's no correlation between talent and how successful you'll be in music. Bob was a brilliant guy, a legal thinker, but guys kind of tangled in the web, and there was a lot of, you know, dealing with the larger labels, and was successful, and he had a lot of bitterness towards it. But, you know, it kind of is what it is. You're you know, land of sharks where people just want to exploit you and they don't really appreciate what you do.
Yeah, but his music lives on, and his memory lives on, and all of us. And closing out here, I'd like to get a closing comment from everyone. First of all, thanks for participating, both our viewers and our participants. Tim, what would you like, if someone came up to you and asked you for a couple sentences on who was Bob Belden, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I would say he's impossible to sum up in a few sentences, and I'm sure there'll be in the future, you know, perhaps, hopefully, even a book by someone who can really write and is well informed and talks to the many people that have something to say about Bob. But Bob was just awe-inspiring and all-inspiring. I mean, he was, you know, we talked about this a little bit, but he was an incredible saxophone player. And he told me when I was getting ready to do my second record for Blue Note Audible Architecture in '94, he said that he was going to stop playing the tenor saxophone. And I had already asked him to be on part of that record. It was a trumpet trio record with bass and drums, Larry Grenadier and Billy Kilson. But I wanted Bob on the record as well, and I thought it was very good timing that I had already asked him to play, and I made it specific. I wanted him to play tenor on this, and I think it's probably one of the last recordings of him playing the tenor. But as Gary has said, he was an amazing tenor saxophone player. I mean, in 2 or 3 notes, you know it's Bob Belden if you're familiar with his playing, and if you're not, you say, who is that? That sounds completely different from anybody I've ever heard. And it's easy to forget with everything else that Bob has done that he was an incredible musician, and everything stemmed from how he wanted to frame his saxophone playing. And that's more than a few sentences, but you know, once I start talking about Bob, it's very hard to stop.
Gary, what are you going to miss most about Bob?
Well, the thing about Bob, Bob was a true original in every aspect of his life. As a musician, as a human being, he was just, there'll never be another person like that. You know, and just in terms of just his breadth, his body of work, his originality, his sound, his contribution, he's sorely missed already, and there'll never be anybody like that again.
You know, I have one thing just to jump in. There's a great quote at the end of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas where Hunter S. Thompson describes Dr. Gonzo, and it's a rather long quote, but one of the parts of that is, you know, he was a prototype too weird for mass production. And, you know,
that's perfect.
I always thought that described Bob.
It's perfect.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thompson, wherever you might be. Nick O'Neill, what's your takeaway on Bob Belden?
Well, again, I knew Bob in a different kind of way, I think, than everybody else, because he sort of permeated our world, which is sort of hard to get involved in. But Bob, I think, I'd say he's one of the most caring people I ever knew. And again, it's caring about other people, but he cared about causes. And he wanted to do good things in the world, and that's rare to get people to take their resources, their time, their energies, their health, and to push to try to get things as big as peace restarted in places in the world where it's not working. So, you know, to think of somebody like that who takes what he has and works it in a way to help other people, that's rare, and I will really miss that about him.
And finally, David Chesky. You were in the studio with Bob. You walked the streets with Bob. What are you going to miss about Bob Belden?
Well, you know what I miss about him? He was a consummate professional. I think the highest compliment you can give somebody in this business is professional, because a lot of people are jive, a lot of people don't have their act together, a lot of people don't really have the skill set to do things. And see, before you're an artist, you have to be a master craftsman. And Bob, to me, was a craftsman. He could write for a big band, he could write for an orchestra. He had his skills together. There's so many people today that get by on jive and just with a great PR person, they really have no substance and skills. Bob was the opposite of this. He was a true professional on that level, like Gil or any of those guys. He had his craft together. When he walked into his studio, he could handle it. He was a professional. I like working with people like that. That, to me, is the ultimate compliment.
Well, true professional, true friend, remarkable creator, man with a fantastic sense of humor, giving, someone we're sure going to miss, someone who can't be replaced. As we're doing this Google Hangout today, we've just learned of the passing of Ornette Coleman. And today is the birthday of Marcus Belgrave, a jazz angel from Detroit. And these remarkable creators aren't with us for very long. We must embrace them and remember them and let us inspire us. Thanks for joining us, everyone, on the Bob Belden Memorial Hangout.